There are beginnings that feel ordinary, like doors opening on familiar rooms. And then there are beginnings that arrive sideways, quiet and uncanny, as though the world itself whispered something it did not mean to say. Rick's story did not begin with fire or triumph, but with a shadow that did not quite belong. Long before the portal gun, before the green swirls of passageways that stitched universes together, there was only a boy who listened too closely to things most people ignored. He noticed how the air shifted before storms, how the stars in the night sky seemed to lean toward him when he asked questions. He noticed how shadows bent when no one was watching. And most of all, he noticed that his own shadow sometimes moved differently than he did. It began softly, almost playfully. When he reached for a toy, the shadow hesitated, as though wondering if it truly wanted to follow. When he turned his head, the shape at his feet tilted more slowly, or bent farther than it should. Rick, small and curious, never told anyone. It felt like a secret between him and the quiet dark. Sometimes at night he would lie in bed with the curtains drawn back, moonlight painting long silver lines across the floor. He'd whisper to the shape beside him, testing to see if it might answer. And though it never spoke, sometimes it flickered in a way that made him certain it was listening. Children are rarely frightened by the strangeness of the world. To them, strangeness feels natural, like a friend that grown-ups simply pretend not to see. So young Rick did not fear his shadow's oddness. If anything, he loved it, as one might love a secret twin. He remembered nights when he would sneak into the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed, dragging a chair across the tiles to reach the bread, the jar of peanut butter, a slice of cheese. His little midnight sandwiches were clumsy, messy, and entirely his own. He would sit at the counter in the dark, chewing slowly, and glance down at the shadow perched at his feet. The shadow would not copy the motions of eating. Instead, it leaned closer, as though savoring the silence with him. Rick thought of it then, not as a reflection, but as a companion. A friend who could not be touched, but who stayed no matter what. He grew a little older. The questions in his head grew heavier, sharper, more insistent. Teachers told him not to ask so many what-ifs, but he could not help it. The world felt too fragile not to tug at. And always his shadow was there, shifting a half-beat late, bending in its own rhythm like a melody faintly out of tune. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, yet it never left him. He was playing outside near dusk, chasing a ball across the uneven grass. He fell, scraping his knee. The sting made his eyes water, but what caught his breath was not the pain. It was the sight of his shadow. For a heartbeat, it did not fall with him. It remained standing, tall and still, while he crouched on the ground. And when he looked up at it, blinking through tears, he thought, no, he felt, that it pitied him. The shadow leaned down a moment later, resuming its mimicry, but Rick never forgot the delay. Never forgot the way it looked at him, not as a copy, but as something apart. Nights after, he would dream of it. Dreams of walking down hallways where the lights flickered and buzzed, where his shadow ran ahead of him instead of behind. Dreams where it stepped into a door he could not open, vanishing with a calmness that left him trembling when he woke. He told no one. Adults might laugh, children might turn away. And so it remained his secret, his shadow, his companion, his quiet mystery. Yet in the folds of that mystery something grew. A kind of yearning, a sense that the world was larger than anyone admitted. He began tinkering with broken radios, pulling them apart with tiny fingers, listening for voices that might slip through the static. Sometimes he swore he heard a laugh or a whisper, faint as starlight. On those nights, when sleep would not come, he'd lie awake and watch his shadow shift on the wall. He wanted to ask it questions. It did about stars, about why things vanish, about why people love and then leave. But no words passed between them, only that steady sense that it understood in ways silence sometimes does. Years later, he would think back on these nights with a mixture of nostalgia and grief, because it was never just a trick of the light. His shadow carried something of him, something he would one day lose, something he would chase across dimensions. But for now, in those tender years, it was simply comfort. A boy and his shadow, a boy who believed that loneliness did not always mean being alone. And sometimes, on the edge of sleep, he felt its hand brush his own, not cold, not warm, but real. Some children take apart toys to see how the gears fit, how the tiny springs coil, how the battery hums. Rick did this too, of course, but he also wanted to take apart the sky. It began one afternoon when he was small enough to sit in the grass and feel the blades rise taller than his knees. Clouds drifted overhead, soft as cotton unraveling. Other children might have imagined shapes. A horse, a dragon, a ship sailing across blue oceans. Rick tilted his head and thought instead, what holds them there? He lay on his back for hours, watching as the clouds stretched and thinned, as sunlight turned gold, then amber, then lilac. The longer he looked, the less the sky seemed like air, and more like a vast ceiling, stitched together by invisible threads. And he wondered if the ceiling could be unscrewed, pried open gently. Would there be another sky folded behind it? That evening, he found an old pair of binoculars in a drawer. The lenses were scratched, the hinges loose. But through them, the stars scattered sharp and clear. The longer he stared, the more the stars trembled, as though waiting to be noticed. His shadow stretched long beside him, darker against the pale dust of the driveway. It did not look at the stars. Instead, it seemed to tilt its head toward him, studying his wonder with quiet patience. "Don't you ever wonder what's above all that?" Rick whispered into the night. His voice was small, but the words felt like pebbles thrown into deep water. The shadow bent a fraction too late, as though nodding. Rick smiled. He decided that was answer enough. Days passed, and his questions grew. He began pulling radios apart, not for music, but for silence. He wanted to know if silence itself contained a code. He sketched diagrams of clouds on notebook paper, drawing arrows that circled endlessly. He even dismantled the family clock once, convinced that if he studied the hands long enough, he might catch time looking back at him. His shadow followed, sometimes obedient, sometimes strange. When Rick leaned over his sketches, the shadow bent too, but at times it drew its head closer, as if reading along. When he fiddled with wires, the shadow's hands moved too slowly, lingering longer at the sparks of copper and light. He never told anyone what he saw. To others, shadows were ordinary, black shapes that obeyed without thought. But Rick knew better. His was curious, almost stubborn. His was learning. One afternoon, storm clouds piled high over the town. Thunder rumbled like a giant shifting in its sleep. Rick ran outside with his small notebook, heart racing. He wanted to sketch the sky as it cracked open. Lightning flashed. For an instant, everything turned white, and in that brief illumination, he saw it. His shadow standing apart from him, its arms raised high, as though it too had reached to tear open the heavens. When the light faded, it settled back at his feet. But Rick's hands trembled as he drew. He wasn't afraid. He was thrilled. It meant he was right. The world was not solid. The world had seams, and his shadow was proof. That night, unable to sleep, he whispered to it again. "Someday I'm going to figure it out. I'll take it all apart, and we'll see what's hiding behind." The shadow didn't answer, but in the pale wash of moonlight, he thought it leaned a little closer. The years edged forward in quiet ways. Rick's quirks multiplied. He took apart radios, clocks, toys, even the toaster once, just to see how heat hid itself inside wires. He was scolded, of course, but the scolding never stuck. The questions inside him were louder than any warning. And sometimes, when he felt especially alone, when the world seemed too heavy for such a small boy, he would sit with his shadow against the wall. He would press his palm to where its hand lay on the floor, and though there was nothing to touch, he felt steadied. One evening, just before sleep, he stared out the window at the stars. His shadow bent across the wall beside his bed. "If I could," he whispered, "I'd climb out there. Past the clouds, past all of it. I'd pull the sky down like a blanket and see what's behind." The shadow tilted its head. For a heartbeat, he imagined it smiling. And so, before he knew words for it, Rick had chosen his path. Not a path of war or glory, not yet, but of questions, of wonder, of quiet determination to open every door the universe tried to close. He was still a child, but in the way he gazed at the stars, you could already see the man he would become. Restless, brilliant, lonely, and forever chasing the seams in the sky. It happened on a summer evening, the kind of evening where the air hums with insects and the sky lingers between gold and violet, reluctant to let go of the day. Rick was still a boy then, old enough to stay out past sunset, young enough to still believe that nothing could be lost forever. He had been playing in the yard with an old rubber ball, the kind that bounced unevenly, always choosing strange angles. The grass was warm under his bare feet, and the world seemed endless. The ball slipped from his hand and rolled into the darker part of the yard, where the trees leaned close together. He chased after it, laughing softly to himself. And that was when he noticed. His laughter thinned, caught in his throat. Because though he had darted quickly, his shadow had not. He turned, expecting to see it stretching behind him as always. But for the first time in his life it wasn't there. The ground was pale under the fading light. Empty. Rick froze. The ball lay at his feet, forgotten. His heart tapped strangely against his ribs, not fast, but hollow, like a knock on a distant door. He whispered, "Where are you?" The wind stirred, brushing the grass. And then, with a quiet delay, as though stepping out of some hidden corner, the shadow slid back to his side. It bent into place beneath him, calm, unchanged, as though nothing unusual had happened. But Rick knew better. Shadows did not wander, shadows did not pause, yet his had. That night, he lay awake long after the house fell silent. The memory of the empty ground haunted him. Had he imagined it? Had his eyes played tricks in the half-light? He rolled onto his side, gazing at the wall where his shadow should be cast. Moonlight spilled through the window, soft and silver, yet the shape stretched a little too far, bent a little too wrong. For a heartbeat, he swore it turned its head, not with him, but on its own. Rick sat up, holding his breath, but the shadow lay still, matching him again. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. He whispered, "Why did you leave?" The words hung in the air. There was no reply, only the sound of the clock downstairs, ticking like a heartbeat too far away. Eventually, drowsiness tugged him under, but even in his dreams he searched for it. Hallways stretched long and dark, and always his shadow was ahead of him, waiting at a door he could not open. The next day, he tried to ignore it. He busied himself with sketches and wires, with taking apart a broken toy car. Yet, every time he glanced at the floor or the wall, he caught himself checking. Is it still there? Is it moving with me? For the most part, it behaved, it followed, it mirrored. But once, just once, when he dropped a screwdriver and bent to pick it up, he caught sight of it bending slower, almost reluctantly. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't even defiance. It was something else. Something harder to name. That evening, as the sun went down, Rick sat on the porch steps. He held the ball loosely in his hands, rolling it back and forth. Shadows stretched long across the ground. He watched his carefully, waiting. The cicadas buzzed. The world turned gold, then grey. And just as the first stars began to prick through the sky, his shadow wavered again. Not gone this time, not entirely, but softer, fainter, as though it were forgetting itself. He whispered, almost pleading, "Don't go!" For a moment the shadow steadied. It grew darker, sharper, clinging to him again. Rick let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was then he understood. It could leave if it wished. And though he didn't know why, the knowledge filled him with both wonder and sorrow. From that night on, he began to watch more closely. He studied not only the stars and the clouds, but the subtle ways his shadow bent, hesitated, or leaned away. It became part of his experiments, though he never wrote it down. This was not something the world would understand. It was only between him and the dark. And somewhere deep inside, though he couldn't explain why, he feared the day might come when it would not return at all. There are memories that cling not because they were grand, but because they were quiet. For Rick, one of those memories began in the hush of midnight, when the house seemed to hold its breath. He was still young then, small enough that the counters rose above him like cliffs. Sleep never held him tightly. His mind was too restless, always humming, always reaching. So while the others slept, Rick would tiptoe from his bed, careful not to let the old boards creak too loudly under his weight. The kitchen waited, still and silvered by moonlight. The clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. To Rick, it felt like entering a world just for him, a secret country of shadows and silence. He dragged a chair across the tiles, wincing at the scrape, though no one stirred upstairs. With small, deliberate hands he reached for bread, for the jar of peanut butter, sometimes for cheese or whatever he could find. The sandwiches he made were messy, uneven things, crusts torn, spreads lopsided. But they were his. He would sit at the counter, legs swinging, chewing slowly. The taste was never remarkable, but the act itself mattered. It was ritual. It was freedom. And always his shadow was there. In the dim kitchen, light, it stretched beside him on the floor. But unlike during the day, when it mimicked his every move, at night it seemed to grow stiller, more watchful. Rick would glance at it between bites, and sometimes, just sometimes, he thought it leaned a little closer, as though sharing the meal in silence. He whispered once, through a mouthful of bread, "You like this too, huh?" Of course, the shadow made no answer. Yet the way it lingered, the way it pooled darker at his feet, felt like a nod. On some nights he would make 2 sandwiches, one for him, one for the space beside him. He would place the second on the counter, untouched, and let it sit there while he ate. It was never about food. It was about presence, about saying, "I see you. You matter too." Sometimes, when the loneliness of being awake while everyone else slept pressed heavy on him, This ritual steadied him. The kitchen smelled faintly of bread and dust, and his small hands left crumbs across the counter. But in those quiet hours, he felt less alone. He remembered one particular night. The rain had begun to fall outside, soft and steady, pattering against the windows. Rick sat with his sandwich, swinging his legs. His shadow pooled on the floor, listening, it seemed, to the music of the storm. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Someday, I'm going to go out there, past all this, past the rain, past the sky. Maybe you'll come with me." When he opened his eyes, lightning flashed across the room. For that brief, brilliant moment, the shadow did not sit at his feet. It stood taller, reaching for the window, as though it, too, longed to go beyond. The flash faded. It returned to its place. But Rick had seen enough. He smiled then, a small, tired smile. "Yeah," he said softly. "I knew you would." The sandwich was half-eaten, the crumbs scattered. He left the other one untouched, its edges growing dry in the night air. He slid from the chair, padded quietly back to his room, and slipped beneath the covers. The storm carried him towards sleep. Later, in dreams, he found himself back in that kitchen, but stranger. The shadows there were thicker, darker, almost alive, and his own shadow walked ahead of him, holding the sandwich in its hand. It turned once to look at him, not unkindly, before vanishing into a doorway that did not exist in waking life. When Rick woke, the dream clung to him like dew. He thought of the empty sandwich still on the counter. He wondered, just for a breath, if perhaps the shadow had taken it after all. He would never tell anyone. The midnight kitchen was his world. His and the shadow's. And though he grew older, though the questions in his mind would one day grow heavier and sharper, the memory of those nights remained. The boy at the counter, the uneven sandwich, the silent companion, and the soft knowledge that even in solitude, he was never truly alone. There are nights when silence feels heavier than stone, and a boy finds himself speaking into the dark simply because the dark is the only thing that listens. Rick was still small, though his mind had already begun to stretch far beyond the fences of childhood. He would lie awake on his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling as though it were only a paper shell stretched above him. Beyond that shell, he believed, were endless places waiting to be opened, endless doors, endless skies. He had already taken apart so many things, clocks, radios, toys, but the world itself, the world was too big to take apart alone. He knew that. And yet, the thought of living without trying, of being ordinary, of simply drifting the way everyone else seemed to drift, filled him with a quiet dread. One night, when sleep would not come, he sat up in bed and looked toward the wall where the moonlight spread his shadow thin and long. It sat there beside him, not quite still, as though it were breathing. He whispered, "I don't want to be like them. I don't want to grow up just eating breakfast, going to work, going home, and waiting to get old. I can't do that. I won't." The words trembled out of him, part defiance, part confession. His shadow did not move at first. It stayed dark and calm on the wall. But when Rick leaned forward, elbows on his knees, he thought he saw it tilt its head toward him, the way someone does when they are listening carefully. He lowered his voice even more, almost afraid of being overheard by the night itself. "I'm going to find out what's behind all this, the clouds, the stars, even the things no one talks about. I'll figure it out. I'll take it apart, and maybe I'll put it back together better." The house around him was silent. Only the hum of the night insects outside broke the stillness. Rick swallowed. "I promise." It was a small vow whispered into the dark, but for him it carried the weight of forever. He did not know who he was making the promise to himself, to the sky, or to the strange shadow that seemed to live and breathe with him. Perhaps all three. And yet, in the stillness that followed, he felt something shift. The shadow deepened, stretching a little darker, as though accepting his vow. Rick lay back down, staring at the faint glow of the stars outside his window. He thought of the future, not in the way children usually dream, of jobs or families or houses, but as a series of doors waiting to be unlocked. At the same time, a smaller ache lived in his chest. He didn't put words to it then, but it was loneliness, the kind that grows from knowing you're different, from realizing that no one around you seems to hear the same hum beneath the world that you do. And so his whispered promise was more than determination. It was also a quiet prayer that somewhere, someday, he might find someone who understood. Before sleep finally claimed him, he spoke once more into the darkness. "Don't leave me, all right? Even if I get lost, even if I mess everything up, just don't leave." The shadow flickered faintly against the wall, its head still bowed, as though sealing the vow in silence. Rick drifted into dreams where stars hung lower than usual, close enough to touch, and doors appeared in the air like hidden seams. In those dreams, his shadow walked a little ahead of him, waiting at each threshold, its hand resting on the latch, as if inviting him through. When he woke, the promise still hummed inside him, a vow too big for a boy, and yet perfectly sized for his restless heart. It would guide him for years, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as burden. But always it was there, that whispered promise, spoken first to the quiet dark, and answered only by a shadow that understood. The summer nights of Rick's childhood were longer than they had any right to be. Hours unfolded like silk, slow and weightless, and he spent them outside more often than in. The old wooden roof of his house became his observatory, and the fields beyond the yard his cathedral. Lying on his back, with his hands laced behind his head, Rick stared upward until his neck ached and his eyes watered. The stars seemed countless, too many to be remembered, yet arranged in patterns he felt certain were meant for him. "They're not just lights," he murmured once, barely loud enough for even himself to hear. "They're messages. They're trying to tell us something." The thought pressed against his mind like a secret waiting to be unwrapped. He began to keep notebooks, small battered ones scavenged from school or found half-used in drawers. In them he copied the skies night after night. At first the drawings were clumsy, dots scattered in uneven clusters, but slowly he grew precise, his hand steadied. The constellations in his notebooks began to look like maps, like coded letters from a distant hand. Sometimes he would whisper their shapes aloud as though rehearsing a new language. Orion, Cassiopeia, Cygnus, names he had scavenged from library books whispered like spells. He didn't only see them as hunters or queens or swans. To Rick they were keys. The keyholes, though, remained hidden. And yet there were nights when he swore the stars shifted as he watched them, faint tremors in the sky, like someone rearranging the letters of a word he had almost deciphered. One evening his mother found him sitting at the window, long past midnight, notebook open on his knees, eyes red from strain. "You'll ruin your eyes, Rick," she said softly, half scolding, half concerned. He didn't look at her. He just kept sketching, his pencil moving quickly, trying to catch the exact angle of a constellation before it slipped away. "I can't stop," he said. "It feels like if I stop I'll miss what they're saying." His mother had no answer for that. She left the room quietly, the floorboards creaking beneath her steps. Rick turned back to the window. The stars were waiting. They had always been waiting. On nights when clouds veiled the sky, he felt restless, even hollow, as though someone had taken away his only companion. The shadow was still with him, yes, but the stars gave him direction. The shadow was a listener. The stars were teachers. Sometimes he would climb the old oak behind the house and sit in its higher branches, where the air felt thinner, cleaner. There he would hold out his hand toward the heavens, fingers spread, as if trying to catch the starlight between his skin. He imagined the stars whispering through the air, like a language too vast for words, too delicate for ears. And in those moments he thought he could almost understand them. He never told anyone about it, not his mother, not his teachers, not even the shadow, though he suspected the shadow already knew. Instead, he held the knowledge close to his chest, like an ember he dared not expose. The more he learned, the more he realized how much he didn't know, and the more he realized how much no one around him seemed to care. They lived their lives looking down at the soil, the roads, the clocks, the bills. Rick lived his life looking up. Sometimes that difference felt like a wound. But when the night was clear and the stars leaned close, the ache softened. He whispered to them, tracing their lines with his finger in the air, and in return he felt less alone. He wrote in his notebook one night, in handwriting so cramped it seemed he was afraid the page might overhear him. They know my promise. The stars know I meant it. And though the words were childish, the feeling was not. It was vast and endless, like the sky itself. Rick closed his notebook and pressed it against his chest, staring upward until the lines of the constellations blurred into one shimmering tapestry. He thought of doors again, doors hidden in the night, waiting for him to learn the right key, the right language, and he thought, one day I will. One day they'll open. The stars above pulsed faintly as if in answer. Rick had grown used to the silence of the night, the kind that pressed close against the windows, heavy and watchful. But this night felt different. It was not silent, it was waiting. He sat cross-legged on the floor of his room, the curtains drawn back to let the starlight fall in faint silver beams across his notebooks. The oak outside rustled in the wind, a hushed and restless sound like pages being turned. And then he felt it, the familiar presence. The shadow had always been near, hovering at the edge of lamplight, sliding along the corners of the walls. It had been his companion since he first swore his promise to the stars. But tonight it leaned closer. "Do you see them?" a voice breathed. It wasn't a voice in the air, but in his thoughts, soft, low, threaded with something ancient. Rick froze, his pencil poised above paper. He had never heard it speak before. "Yes," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking aloud or only answering within himself. "I see them." The shadow shifted, stretching across the room like smoke drawn toward fire. Its edges trembled as though barely able to contain themselves. "They are calling you." The words settled into Rick's chest like stones. He swallowed hard, staring at the constellations he had sketched just hours before. "Calling me?" The shadow curled along the floorboards, climbing slowly up the wall. It hovered beside the window, framing the stars beyond. "Not everyone hears, but you do." Rick's breath quickened. He pressed his palm to the notebook, as though to keep the pages from slipping away. "Why me?" The pause that followed was long enough that Rick wondered if the shadow had withdrawn again. But then came the whisper, heavier this time. "Because you promised." Rick's chest tightened. Yes, he remembered. That night, as a child, looking at the stars and swearing he would never leave them, never forget them, never look away, a promise made by a boy who had not understood its weight. But promises had a way of binding themselves deeper than he had realized. The shadow drifted closer, coiling around him like a cloak. His skin prickled with cold. He did not draw back. "What do they want me to do?" he asked, voice trembling. The answer came not as words but as sensation, the deep pull of distance, the ache of something far beyond the horizon. A direction, though not yet a path. Rick closed his eyes. The stars still burned bright behind his eyelids, etched into his vision. When he opened them, the shadow was no longer clinging to the corners. It sat across from him, dark and formless, yet somehow steady, watching, waiting. He felt no fear, or perhaps he did, but it was a fear softened by trust, the way a child trusts the dark woods because he has walked them so many nights before. "I'll follow," he whispered. The shadow did not answer. It only leaned back into its silence, but Rick could feel the satisfaction pulsing from it like a hidden smile. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the window, the shadow at his side, and let the stars burn their patterns into his mind. He began to draw not just what he saw, but what he felt. Constellations bending into new shapes, maps of places he had never visited, symbols he could not name. And for the first time he knew he was not learning the language of the stars alone. He was being taught. The shadow whispered again, softer now, a lull that settled into his bones. "One day you will go where they call. One day the doors will open." Rick pressed his forehead to the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, until the stars themselves blurred into a single, endless light. The first time Rick left his room at night, the world felt like it was holding its breath. He slipped quietly down the narrow staircase, careful not to wake his mother, careful not to let the floorboards creak beneath his weight. The door gave only the faintest sigh as it opened, and then he was outside, alone, wrapped in the cool hush of midnight. Above him, the stars glittered with an almost painful clarity. They seemed sharper than they had ever been, as though they had been waiting for him to step beneath their watchful gaze. The shadow stretched long behind him, then slid forward to his side, gliding across the ground like ink spilled upon stone. It said nothing at first, but Rick felt its presence urging him onward. He followed. The road was empty. Houses hunched in darkness, their windows shuttered, their gardens asleep. The lamplight swayed faintly in the night breeze, and each pool of yellow glow felt like a small, fragile island. Between them stretched the wide, breathing dark. Rick walked, without knowing where his feet were carrying him. Yet the shadow moved with purpose, drifting toward the old bridge at the edge of town. He had crossed it many times in daylight, but under starlight it felt transformed. The river below a mirror, breaking the constellations into trembling fragments. He paused halfway across and leaned on the railing. The water glimmered beneath, restless and deep. For a moment, he imagined stepping over, falling into the sky's reflection, and being carried to the stars themselves. The shadow's whisper brushed against him, soft as breath. Not yet. Rick straightened. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation, the way one feels just before a door is opened. He crossed the bridge and found himself in the fields beyond the town. The grass rippled in silver waves, each blade tipped with dew that caught the starlight. The air smelled of earth and night flowers, sweet and faintly bitter. Here, away from houses and lamplight, the stars revealed themselves fully. The sky was endless, overflowing, alive. Rick tilted his head back until his neck ached, and still he could not drink in enough. The shadow lingered close, and for the first time Rick thought he heard not just a whisper, but a sound like humming, low, steady, almost like a song too old to remember its words. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, voice hushed so as not to break the stillness. The shadow only pulsed, stretching upward toward the sky. Rick sat down in the field. He opened his notebook, fingers trembling, with the weight of what he was about to draw. The constellations above no longer seemed like distant pictures. They were instructions, patterns of a map he was only just beginning to understand. Line by line, he traced them. Stars bent into curves that formed shapes no one else would have seen. Circles and spirals emerged, symbols that seemed both familiar and alien. Each mark came with a strange certainty, as though he were not inventing, but remembering. The shadow leaned over his shoulder, its form rippling in rhythm with the night. At times its outline seemed to blur with the very constellations above, as though it were part of the sky's design. Hours slipped away unnoticed. When Rick finally closed the notebook, the horizon was already beginning to pale, the first faint wash of dawn smudging the stars. He rose, stiff from the cold, and turned back toward home. The shadow followed, though it seemed reluctant, clinging to the last scraps of night as though mourning the retreat of the stars. When Rick stepped back through his door, the house was still asleep. He climbed the stairs, returned to his room, and lay down without undressing. He did not sleep. His eyes remained fixed on the fading patterns above his bed, and his heart whispered the same word the shadow had given him at the bridge. Not yet. For now the stars had only called him to listen. But he knew the time would come when they would call him to act. And when that moment arrived, he would follow. By now the stars had begun to feel like more than just points of light. They were a language, a rhythm, a hum beneath everything Rick knew. But the world did not stop when the sun rose, and slowly he discovered that the shadow, his silent companion of nights, had begun to follow him into the daylight too. It was first subtle. A flicker at the edge of his vision, a dark shape lingering too long in a corner, or leaning just slightly differently than the angle of the sun should allow. At first, Rick thought he imagined it. The shadow had always been quiet, obedient, but now it seemed aware. One morning he sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, sketching spirals he had traced in the stars hours before. A bird tapped against the window, chirping insistently. His mother hummed as she moved through the house. The shadow stretched along the floor, longer than it should have been for the angle of the sun, almost reaching the walls of the room. Rick froze. He looked again. It was moving, subtly, as if leaning closer toward the notebook, reading his sketches without being asked. He swallowed, quiet and careful. You're here." The shadow remained still for a heartbeat, then shifted just a little, and Rick felt a strange warmth, as though it were nodding. From that day forward, it became impossible to ignore. The shadow was not only a night companion, it slipped into daylight hours, observing, guiding, teaching. Rick began to see patterns in the sun as he had in the stars, reflections in puddles, bends in the branches, the way light fractured through windows. Sometimes he imagined it spoke without words, shaping him with patience and subtle insistence. He found himself pausing mid-step, sketchbook in hand, watching a leaf twirl, feeling that the smallest details contained hidden codes. Other children played outside, laughing, kicking balls and chasing one another, but Rick walked between them like someone moving through a dream. He would glance at his shadow, stretched across the pavement, and it would mimic him perfectly, or almost perfectly. Sometimes it bent just slightly differently, a finger turned, an arm stretched too far, and in those moments he understood that it had its own will. At school, the world felt flat compared to the night skies he had learned to read. Teachers spoke in rules and schedules, his friends joked about cartoons and candies. But he saw everything differently, the angles of the light, the hum beneath the chatter, the patterns formed by tiny cracks in the walls. His shadow moved beside him even here. Not just as a dark shape, but as a reminder, a quiet nudge to look closer, to notice what others missed. One afternoon, sitting beneath the oak at the edge of town, he traced constellations in the sunlight filtered through leaves. The shadow leaned toward the patterns, following the arcs of his fingers, and Rick felt a kind of communion, a rhythm that existed even in broad daylight. And yet, the daytime shadow was different. It felt heavier, more deliberate. There were moments when Rick caught it bending toward something unseen, toward doors, windows, cracks in the wall, and he realized the guidance he had trusted by night now extended beyond darkness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he knew. He could feel it in the air, the promise of the unseen, the pull of things that lay beyond ordinary perception. When he returned home that evening, the night stretched before him like a reward. The stars waited. But Rick knew now that even in the sun's bright gaze, the world had secrets, hidden doors, folded skies, echoes of the language he was learning, and his shadow was always there to remind him silently, observe, follow, remember. Rick pressed his palm to the wall where it rested that evening, murmuring softly, "I see you. I understand." It did not reply. Yet he felt a faint pulse, like a heartbeat beneath his fingertips, and he understood. The shadow had never been just a reflection of him. It was a companion, a guide, a guardian, and perhaps even a teacher. And in that realization he felt both wonder and a subtle, quiet fear. Because he now knew the world he was moving through was larger than anyone else imagined, and some part of him would always be stepping into spaces only the stars and the shadow could see. The world had begun to feel like a puzzle to Rick, one with pieces that shimmered faintly in the corner of the eye and whispers that only he could hear. The stars had taught him patience, the shadow had taught him attention, and tonight the night seemed to hum with promise, as though the air itself were pointing towards something unseen. He wandered again beyond the town, along paths he knew yet felt entirely new under the light of a low, silver moon. The fields stretched wide, the grass bending in subtle waves, each blade tipped with dew. The shadow followed, longer and sharper than usual, its edges flowing with quiet urgency. And then he saw it. A door, small and narrow, tucked beneath the roots of an ancient oak, hidden almost entirely by gnarled branches. He had passed this tree countless times in daylight, never noticing anything unusual. But now, guided by the quiet insistence of his companion and the pull in the night air, it was impossible to miss. Rick approached it slowly, his hand brushing against the rough bark. The door was cool beneath his fingers, solid and smooth where the wood had been worn by time. A faint hum emanated from it, a vibration he felt in his chest rather than his ears. The shadow paused beside him, pooling on the ground like ink. For the first time, Rick noticed that it seemed to lean toward the door, not just hovering nearby, but pressing gently against the threshold, as though saying, "This way." Rick knelt, tracing the outline with his fingertips. "Is this real?" he whispered. The shadow did not answer, but the air around him pulsed faintly, almost like a breath, like the world itself waiting for him to decide. He turned the knob. It was loose, resisting only briefly before giving way. The door opened with a sigh, and Rick leaned forward, peering into the darkness beyond. It was small, narrow, like a tunnel curling beneath the roots of the oak. The scent of damp earth rose to meet him, and faint light spilled from somewhere deep within, glowing like a secret. He felt a shiver, but it was not fear. It was anticipation. It was recognition. Something had been waiting for him here, hidden beneath the ordinary, and now it was revealing itself. Rick slipped inside. The shadow followed, bending and flowing around him, its form adapting to the confined space. The tunnel was lined with roots and soil, faintly luminous veins pulsing along the walls. Every step echoed softly, a gentle rhythm in the quiet. He reached the end of the tunnel and found a small chamber, barely large enough for him to sit. The walls glimmered faintly, reflecting light that seemed to come from nowhere. And in the center, etched into the stone floor, was a pattern of stars, a constellation not seen in any night sky he had recorded. Rick knelt, heart pounding softly, tracing the pattern with his finger. It felt alive, like the pulse of a hidden world. He realized then that this was no ordinary chamber. This was a door between what he knew and what lay beyond, a place where the shadow and the stars had conspired to lead him. The shadow drifted closer, folding itself along the edge of the pattern, silent and patient. Rick pressed his hand to the stone, feeling a faint warmth seep into him, and whispered, "I'm here." "I understand. I'll follow." The air pulsed again, faint and insistent. Rick traced the constellation one last time before leaning back against the wall. He could feel the doorway humming in tune with him, the shadow at his side, and the stars overhead, even unseen through the thick canopy, seeming to bend their light toward this hidden chamber. For the first time, he felt it fully. The world was larger than anyone else could see, and he had been chosen, or perhaps he had chosen himself, to explore its quiet secrets. He closed his eyes, listening to the pulse of the chamber, and for a long moment he let himself drift in its stillness. The shadow leaned close, a silent guardian, a teacher, and a reminder that he was not alone. And somewhere in that darkness, faintly, he imagined he could hear the stars whispering his name, guiding him deeper toward doors yet unseen, toward worlds yet to be understood. Word count, approximately 1,238. Rick stayed in the chamber longer than he had intended, though time here seemed different, stretched and soft as cloud. The walls glimmered faintly, tracing lines of hidden constellations that pulsed in gentle rhythm like a heartbeat beneath stone. The shadow coiled beside him, its dark form shifting subtly in tune with the light, as though it were part of the pattern itself. He traced the etched constellation again with his finger, noting how it bent, spiraled, and looped in ways that reminded him of the skies he had studied from his bedroom window. But these stars did not follow the maps he knew. They were different, strange and precise, yet faintly familiar. Rick leaned closer, whispering to the constellation, as he had whispered to the stars themselves, "Show me." And in the stillness he felt it, a soft vibration beneath his fingertips, a resonance that rippled through him, settling in his chest. It was not voice, not sound, but meaning, a pattern waiting to be understood. The shadow shifted beside him. It was closer now, almost as if it were guiding his hand. Rick let it, feeling the silent instruction flow through him, shaping the movements of his fingers. The spirals bent slightly at his touch, and he realized he was not only reading this constellation, he was speaking to it. The first lesson he understood was patience. Not the kind learned by waiting for clocks or meals, but the kind that came from observing, tracing, following, and letting the pattern reveal itself over time. Rushing would destroy the rhythm, hurrying would break the connection. He had to breathe with it, let it hum in quiet sync with his own pulse. Hours passed. Rick's small hand moved over the stone floor, tracing lines that seemed to shift subtly beneath him. Sometimes a segment glowed brighter, faintly, as though acknowledging his attention. Other times a curve receded, waiting for a different approach, and always the shadow was there. Leaning near, coiling closer, bending with him as if the darkness itself were patient, a quiet teacher of unseen languages. He realized something else, too. This chamber was not merely a place, but a mirror of understanding. The patterns on the floor mirrored the movements of the stars, yes, but they also mirrored something inside him, the restless curiosity, the attention, the longing to see more than anyone else. A small, cautious wonder bloomed in his chest. I can feel it," he whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with awe. "I understand it, a little." The shadow pulsed at his side, a slow, deliberate rhythm, and he understood that it was pleased. Not with accomplishment, not with success, but with the act of learning itself. Rick lay back against the stone, letting the glow wash over him. In the chamber there was no distinction between night and day, between shadow and light, between sky and stone. There was only attention, observation, quiet understanding. For a long while he closed his eyes and let the patterns imprint themselves on his mind. When he opened them again, the constellation seemed to shimmer with approval, bending faintly toward him. He smiled softly. "Thank you," he whispered to the stars, to the chamber, to the shadow. "I'll keep learning." And in that moment, he felt the first brush of something extraordinary. The knowledge that the world was speaking to him, in codes and shapes, in whispers and glimmers, and that he was not only a listener, but a participant. Rick pressed his hand to the cool stone one last time before rising, letting the shadow guide him to the tunnel that led back into the fields. Outside, the night air was heavy with dew, and the stars scattered themselves across the sky, faintly brighter than usual, as if nodding to him in acknowledgement. As he walked home beneath the pale silver light, he felt a strange calm. He had taken his first lesson, and it had nothing to do with speed or strength or cleverness. It had to do with patience, observation, attention, and trust. The shadow stayed close at his side, silent but insistent. Rick knew that it had more lessons yet, more guidance, more quiet truths to reveal. But for now, the first had been learned, and that, he thought, was enough. The next day, the town felt smaller than usual. The streets, houses, and fences, all the familiar shapes, seemed to contract, as if his mind had stretched too far the night before, and the world itself could not keep up. The shadow trailed beside him, its edges soft and deliberate, bending toward invisible lines only it could see. Rick did not go to school. He wandered instead toward the woods beyond the eastern edge of town, where sunlight sifted through the trees in lazy gold fingers. The air smelled of moss, damp earth, and pine. He could feel the faint pull of the hidden chamber guiding him, not with a voice, but a tug, a rhythm beneath the surface of the day. He pressed forward, past the trees he had known since childhood, deeper into spaces that felt new and secret. Every leaf, every branch seemed to shimmer slightly under the shadow's presence, as if the forest itself recognized him as someone attuned to its whispers. And then he saw it, a set of markings carved into the bark of an ancient oak, half hidden beneath moss and lichen. lines that did not match the growth of the tree, patterns that curved and twisted, spiraling faintly like the constellations in his notebook. Rick knelt. His fingers traced the lines carefully. It was a map, though not one that led to treasure or gold. It led to hidden spaces, thresholds, and places tucked beyond ordinary vision. The symbols pulsed faintly, familiar and alive, as though they had been waiting for him to notice. The shadow leaned over his shoulder. Its presence was warm, heavy, protective. Rick realized that this map, hidden for so long, was meant for him. Or perhaps he thought he had been chosen by it without knowing. He followed the lines, stepping lightly between trees through underbrush that whispered against his legs. Every step felt guided, deliberate, and yet spontaneous, a paradox he did not question. The woods seemed to breathe with him, expanding and contracting in rhythm with his heartbeat. At one point, he paused beside a small brook. Water ran over smooth stones, catching sunlight in fractured glimmers. The map led across it, and Rick tested the stepping stones carefully, balancing, listening to the whisper of the shadow behind him. The stones felt warm underfoot, as though welcoming him. He crossed. Deeper still, the forest opened into a small clearing. Moss covered the ground in thick, soft layers. At the center lay another strange mark, a pattern similar to the constellation in the chamber, etched faintly into stone. It hummed faintly beneath his fingers. Rick knelt, heart thudding softly. "So this is it," he whispered. "Another piece." The shadow coiled beside him, stretching toward the stone, almost blending into its glow. Rick felt the connection. The map, the stone, the constellation, the shadow, the stars. A delicate web pulling him further into understanding. He spent hours tracing the lines, drawing the hidden patterns in his notebook, sketching symbols that seemed to hum with the faint pulse of life. Each mark was a secret message, a lesson, a reminder that the world was more than it seemed. When the sun began to dip behind the trees, he reluctantly rose. The forest was quiet now, filled with long shadows, but the pull remained in his chest, a gentle insistence that the journey was far from over. Rick walked back toward town, slowly, shadow at his side, the notebook pressed to his chest. He thought of the hidden chamber, of the stars above, and of the soft language of patience and attention that had guided him this far. And in the quiet of the evening, he made a small vow to himself. He would follow these maps wherever they led, even if the paths were strange, even if the journey seemed endless. Because he understood now, the world had secrets, and he had begun to learn its language. The shadow pulsed beside him in approval, its edges stretching just slightly as though smiling. Rick stepped into the town once more, but the streets felt less like boundaries and more like a threshold, a place between what was ordinary and what he was beginning to understand. The hidden map, he realized, was only the beginning. The forest had become familiar, yet strange. Every path Rick had walked before now seemed layered with secrets, like the world had folded itself just beyond ordinary perception. The hidden map led him further than he had gone before, guiding him through groves where sunlight barely touched the ground and moss swallowed footsteps. The shadow stayed close, a constant rhythm at his side. It pulsed faintly, a quiet insistence that he pay attention, that he watch the spaces between what was seen and what was hidden. Rick approached a narrow ravine, its sides steep and slick with moss. The map indicated that he should cross, but the stepping stones were faint, covered with roots and loose earth. His first attempt wobbled. A small rock shifted beneath his foot, sending a thrill of fear up his spine. He froze. The shadow leaned toward him, its edges curling gently in the air, patient, urging him to breathe. Rick took a deep breath, steadying himself. He remembered the first lesson: patience, observation, attention. He watched the stones, listened to the quiet hum of the forest, felt the pulse of the earth beneath him. Slowly, carefully, he placed one foot, then another. The stones held. A soft smile crept across his face. "Not just moving," he whispered, "observing first, feeling the rhythm." The shadow pulsed faintly, approval rippling through the air around him. It seemed to guide the next step, a subtle nudge that went unnoticed by any other observer. Rick realized that trust was also part of this lesson. Trust in the unseen, trust in the guidance that had brought him here, trust in himself. He crossed the ravine successfully, though his heart still thudded from the first tremor of fear. And beyond, the forest opened into a small glade. At its center lay another stone pattern, faint and worn but alive with a gentle glow. Rick knelt, tracing the design with his fingers. It hummed beneath his touch, a language he was beginning to understand more fully. Each line, each curve, was a small instruction, not just about the world outside, but about his own mind and heart. Hours passed in quiet study. Rick began to notice the smallest details: a leaf out of place, the curve of a root, the way light fell at an unusual angle. Each observation was a test, each discovery a lesson. He realized that the forest itself was both puzzle and teacher, and that the shadow was his guide, pointing him toward what he might not yet see. Eventually the sun began to dip behind the trees, painting the glade in soft gold. Rick rose, exhausted but calm. The forest had tested him, not with danger, but with patience, observation, and trust. And he had passed. He walked back along the familiar path, shadow at his side, notebook pressed to his chest. The steps felt lighter now, more deliberate, as though the rhythm of the forest had become part of him. When he returned home that evening, the world outside seemed unchanged. The town slept quietly under the last traces of daylight. But Rick knew the truth. He had changed. He had learned that attention could guide him further than fear ever could, that patience could transform hesitation into understanding. And in the quiet of his room, as he traced the hidden patterns in his notebook by starlight, he felt the soft pulse of the shadow, its presence a promise. There were more tests to come, and he was ready. The stars above twinkled faintly, unseen yet present, as though nodding in quiet approval. Rick lay down, exhausted but awake, heart humming with understanding, and thought, the journey is only beginning. Rick walked deeper into the forest than ever before, guided by the faint pulse of the shadow. The trees here were taller, older, their trunks gnarled and thick with moss. The air was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something faintly sweet, like distant flowers blooming in secret. Then he heard it. A soft, constant hum, carried on the wind, gentle yet insistent. He followed the sound, letting the shadow guide him, and soon he saw the river. It was unlike any river he had ever known. The water glimmered faintly, not with reflected sunlight or moonlight, but with tiny lights that danced along its surface like fireflies trapped beneath the current. They pulsed softly, flickering in rhythm with his heartbeat. The shadow moved closer to the edge, curling along the bank as if urging him forward. Rick stepped carefully, feeling the cool mist rising from the river, and knelt beside the water. The lights shimmered as he reached out, brushing his fingertips against the surface. Each ripple carried a faint whisper, so soft that he almost doubted he had heard it. But the meaning was clear. The river was speaking, not with words, but with rhythm, pulse, and movement. Rick traced patterns in the water with his fingers, following the currents and eddies as they swirled around rocks and roots. The lights bent and flickered in response, as though acknowledging his attention. He realized with a quiet thrill that this river was a living map, a guide of currents and flows, both literal and metaphorical. The shadow leaned close, its edges reflecting the faint glow of the water. Rick felt a warm reassurance in its presence, as though it were telling him, observe, listen, learn. He spent hours beside the river, watching the lights, following the subtle pulses. He noticed how the patterns shifted as the night deepened, how currents intertwined, how small disturbances created ripples that echoed far beyond their origin. It was a lesson in patience, in attention, in the delicate balance between action and observation. Rick whispered softly to the river, almost as if afraid to break the spell. I see you. I hear you. I understand a little. And though the lights did not speak in words, their gentle flicker seemed to affirm him, guiding his thoughts, shaping his understanding of the hidden rhythms of the world. Eventually, the first pale light of dawn crept through the trees. The river's glow dimmed with the rising sun, but Rick felt a quiet satisfaction. He had learned something new, something that could not be taught in classrooms or books. It was knowledge of the unseen, of subtle guidance, of rhythm, of connection between shadow, stars, and self. As he rose to leave, the shadow stretched beside him, almost touching the water's edge, and Rick understood that the river would remain, waiting for him, patient, constant, and alive. The forest seemed to sigh as he walked home, the whisper of lights lingering in his mind, carrying with it the promise of more discoveries yet to come. That night, in the quiet of his room, Rick traced the patterns of the river in his notebook, the glowing shapes mirrored faintly on the paper. The stars outside his window seemed brighter, as though reflecting the river's pulse, and the shadow rested nearby, silent and steady. Rick lay back on his bed, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the night, and whispered softly to himself, "The world is larger than I imagined, and I am learning its language." The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed softly against the edges of the world, gentle and complete. Rick sat beneath the great oak at the edge of the forest, shadow at his side, and let the night settle around him. The stars above shimmered faintly, their distant light threading through the branches, pulling him into their silent rhythm. He did not move, he did not speak. He simply sat, feeling the pulse of the world in the soil beneath him, in the soft sway of the leaves, in the subtle vibration of the shadow at his side. For a long time, Rick thought nothing would happen. But the shadow shifted, curling gently against him, and he realized that this stillness itself was a lesson. Not all learning came from action, from movement, from discovery. Some of it came from listening, from waiting, from allowing the world to speak to him in its own time. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly, drawing the night into his lungs, letting it wash over him. Each exhale carried a sense of release, a quiet surrender to the rhythm of the unseen. The stars above, the forest around him, even the shadow beside him, all were patient teachers, and he was their attentive pupil. Time became fluid. He could feel the gentle sway of the earth, the heartbeat of the forest, the pulse of the hidden rivers and secret maps he had already discovered. The patterns were everywhere, and in the stillness they revealed themselves with clarity that movement could never allow. The shadow stretched slightly as though drawing him closer to understanding. Rick felt a warmth spread through him, a recognition that the quietest moments often held the deepest truths. He opened his eyes and saw the stars reflected faintly in the puddles along the forest floor, mirrored as if the world itself were repeating the lessons of patience, attention, and trust. Rick traced a finger over one of the reflections, smiling softly, realizing that even the smallest gestures, the act of noticing, of being present, carried meaning. He thought of the hidden chamber, the river of whispering lights, the secret maps in the woods. Each had taught him something new, but all of it had been incomplete without this stillness, without the pause to absorb, to reflect, to let the world shape him gently. Rick leaned back against the tree, shadow coiled beside him, and whispered softly, almost to himself, "I understand now. I see the rhythm. I'll follow it, patiently." The night seemed to pulse in answer, a soft, flowing echo through the leaves and stars. He let himself sink fully into the quiet, into the rhythm of the unseen, feeling that the world was vast, secret, and endlessly alive. When he finally rose to leave, the forest felt warmer, friendlier, as if acknowledging his new understanding. The shadow moved with him, patient and steady, guiding him back along paths he had already walked, yet now somehow transformed. Rick returned home under the first pale light of dawn, carrying the quiet of the night within him. He climbed the stairs to his room, notebook in hand, and for a long while simply wrote. Lines, patterns, constellations, rivers of light, tracing the language the world had shared with him. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt a deep calm settle over him. The shadow rested nearby, and the stars outside his window shimmered faintly, patient and eternal. Rick whispered softly a promise both to himself and to the night. "I will continue. I will follow. I will listen." And somewhere, in the gentle rhythm of the universe, the shadow pulsed once more, a quiet smile in the darkness. The morning air was soft and cool as Rick stepped beyond his house, shadow at his side. The town lay quiet, wrapped in its usual routine, unaware of the currents and whispers that moved just beyond perception. But Rick had begun to notice things others overlooked. Small presences, subtle and patient, that seemed to linger in the spaces between trees, stones, and rooftops. At first, he thought it was imagination. A flutter at the edge of vision, a faint rustle in the leaves, the sensation of eyes that were not his own, watching kindly. But over days and nights, the pattern became undeniable. The world was quietly alive in ways no one else seemed to notice, and he was beginning to see it. He wandered to the edge of the forest where sunlight fell in scattered shafts across the mossy ground. A tiny figure of light flickered among the roots of an old tree. It was small, almost invisible, pulsing faintly as though breathing. The shadow shifted beside him, leaning toward the presence. Rick knelt. "Hello," he whispered softly. "I see you." The light shimmered, expanding slightly, then recoiling, delicate and cautious. Rick held his hand still, waiting. Patience had taught him much, and he knew that this was another lesson. One in observation, trust, and quiet respect. Over the coming days, Rick noticed more. Another shimmer among the branches, a faint glimmer dancing along the riverbank. Tiny movements in the underbrush, small companions of light and air that seemed to follow him, attentive yet unseen by others. The shadow remained his anchor, guiding him, teaching him how to recognize these subtle presences without fear or haste. Rick learned to move gently, to breathe slowly, to let the world reveal itself rather than force him into discovery. One evening, as the stars began to appear overhead, he sat beside the river of whispering lights. The hidden companions gathered around, small pulses of presence that seemed to echo the rhythms of the stars themselves. Rick traced patterns in the river with his fingers, and the companions responded with soft glimmers dancing lightly on the water's surface. Rick smiled softly. "You're here," he murmured. "I see you. I understand a little." The shadow pulsed beside him, stretching slightly as though pleased. Rick realized that these companions were not separate from the world he had been learning to read. They were part of the same language, another layer of understanding. The patterns of light, the hidden maps, the constellation chamber, the river, all spoke to a universe alive with quiet presence, with subtle guidance, with lessons waiting to be discovered. For the first time, he felt the vastness of the hidden network around him. The shadow was not the only guide, the stars were not the only teachers. There were companions in the corners, in the streams, in the air, gentle, patient, waiting for him to recognize them. Rick lay back in the moss, letting the night wrap around him. The shadow coiled nearby, the companions shimmered softly, and the stars pulsed faintly above. He realized that he was not alone, not in the way he had once understood, but in a deeper, quieter sense. The world was full of hidden companions, guiding, observing, teaching, and he was learning, step by patient step, to move alongside them. As he closed his eyes, he whispered softly, "Thank you. I will follow. I will listen." And in the quiet, the forest sighed, the river glimmered, the stars pulsed, and the shadow remained, a steady, patient presence beside him, guiding him onward. Ick wandered deeper into the forest that evening, the shadow stretching beside him, gentle and patient. The hidden companions glimmered faintly among the trees and moss, small pulses of light that seemed to respond to his movements. He had watched them for days, quietly, attentively, but tonight he felt a subtle nudge. Perhaps it was time to reach beyond observation and make a connection. He knelt beside a small clearing where one companion glimmered more brightly than the others. It flickered softly, hovering above a patch of moss, delicate and alive. Rick extended a hand slowly, careful not to startle it. "I want to show you something," he whispered. "Will you come closer?" The light paused, quivering slightly, then edged forward. The shadow coiled nearby, pulsing gently, as though encouraging patience and careful attention. Rick smiled softly. He traced a pattern on the ground. Spirals and lines, similar to those in his notebook, inspired by the stars and the secret chamber. The companion flickered in response, brightening and dimming along the curves, following the rhythm of his fingers. A thrill of understanding rippled through Rick. This was no longer simply observation, it was communication. A shared language formed from patience, attention, and trust. He whispered softly, "I think we can understand each other if we pay attention." The light responded, moving along the patterns with him, pulsing gently, mimicking the rhythms he traced. Rick felt a warm sense of companionship that went beyond words, a quiet connection that belonged to the night, to the forest, to the hidden world of shadows and stars. He spent hours there, tracing patterns, sharing rhythms, listening to the faint pulses of the companion's light. It seemed to teach him as much as he taught it, how to move slowly, how to be patient, how to notice the subtle currents of the world. When the night grew deeper and the stars spread across the sky like scattered whispers, Rick leaned back on the moss, smiling softly. The companion hovered above him, faint and gentle, a reminder that the universe was full of small, waiting presences, and that trust and attention could turn observation into communion. The shadow curled beside him, its form warm and steady. Rick felt a soft pulse in his chest, a quiet joy that came from being seen and understood, even by beings invisible to others. "I understand a little more now," he whispered, watching the companion pulse with a gentle rhythm. "And I will keep learning. Eventually, The first light of dawn crept through the trees. The companion flickered softly, almost nodding, before retreating into the shadows of the forest. Rick rose, brushing dew from his hands, feeling a quiet reverence for the world around him. The shadow guided him back along the familiar path, steady and patient, the forest alive with the hum of unseen currents. That morning, as he returned to his room, he pressed his hand to the notebook. He sketched the patterns he had traced, the rhythms he had shared, and felt a quiet promise. There were more secrets to uncover, more companions to meet, more lessons in patience, attention, and trust. Rick lay back on his bed that night, shadow coiled at his side, companion somewhere in the forest, stars pulsing above. And he whispered softly, almost to himself, "I will follow. I will listen. I will understand." Rick moved through the forest under a sky strewn with quiet stars. The shadow followed close, curling and stretching along the edges of the path, a steady pulse in the dark. The companions flitted ahead, tiny points of light moving between trees, across streams, and along moss-covered rocks. He noticed something new tonight. The companions were not simply individual presences. They responded to each other, creating subtle currents of light and rhythm. When one shifted, another would follow, echoing its motion in a delicate, almost musical pattern. Rick paused to watch, feeling the gentle sway of the forest in sync with their movements. The air seemed to hum faintly, a rhythm that was not sound but vibration, a flow connecting shadow, light, and living earth. Rick knelt beside a pool of water where a small cluster of companions hovered, swirling their lights in patterns that reflected in the still surface. Each flicker, each pulse, was mirrored by another, creating waves of understanding that traveled far beyond the eye. Rick extended a hand, brushing it over the surface of the pool. The lights danced in response, their currents extending across the water and into the forest, echoing among the trees. He realized that he could feel the flow, not with sight alone, but with attention, with the quiet focus of being present. The shadow shifted beside him, leaning closer, as if reminding him of the first lessons: patience, observation, trust. Rick breathed deeply, letting the rhythms of light and shadow wash over him. He traced a pattern in the air with his fingers, and the companions followed, their currents weaving around him, through him, connecting the pulse of the river, the sway of the trees, and the heartbeat of the night. Hours passed, though time seemed to stretch and bend. Rick moved slowly, deliberately, in harmony with the currents, noticing how the smallest gestures, a tilt of his hand, a pause in motion, echoed outward. The companions responded, shifting patterns, looping light through branches, across rocks and along the soft earth beneath him. He whispered softly, "I understand. The currents are all connected. Every movement matters." The shadow pulsed in affirmation. Rick leaned back against a mossy log, eyes wide and calm. The night, the companions, the forest, the river, the stars above, all seemed part of a single, quiet conversation, a language that existed beneath words and beyond sight. Rick stayed there until the moon hung high and the first whispers of dawn touched the sky. The companions gradually retreated, their currents fading into shadows and light, leaving behind a quiet hum in the forest, a lingering rhythm in the earth, and in his chest. As he walked home, the shadow coiled gently beside him. Rick carried the echo of the currents within him, the memory of the subtle connections, and a soft understanding that the forest was alive with lessons. Lessons not taught, but revealed to those patient enough to notice. That night, as he lay in bed, he traced the patterns in his notebook. The currents of light, the interactions between the companions, and the rhythm of the hidden streams all flowed across the pages. Rick closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the night, the forest, the shadow, and the unseen companions, a quiet harmony that seemed to stretch outward toward the stars themselves. He whispered softly into the dark, "I will follow. I will learn. I will listen." And the shadow pulsed, patient and steady, a silent echo of understanding, as Rick drifted into sleep, carrying the currents with him. The forest that evening was quieter than usual. The usual rustle of leaves and flicker of companions softened into near stillness. Rick moved slowly, shadow coiled beside him, each step deliberate. There was a feeling in the air, a gentle tension that suggested he was not entirely alone. By a glade bathed in the faint glow of hidden lights, he noticed a figure, not moving, not speaking, yet present, a subtle energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the forest itself. The companions gathered near the figure, circling faintly, shimmering in acknowledgement. Rick paused, unsure, yet drawn closer. The shadow leaned slightly forward, a silent prompt to approach, to observe. He stepped lightly into the clearing, heart steady, senses alert, but calm. The figure remained still, a presence rather than a shape, yet somehow inviting. Rick felt no fear, only curiosity and a deep sense that whatever lesson was to come would require patience. He knelt on the mossy ground, mirroring the quiet stillness. He waited. Minutes passed. The companions flitted gently, forming delicate arcs of light around him. The figure seemed to respond, not with motion or words, but with a subtle shift of energy, a pulse that aligned with his own heartbeat. Rick whispered softly, "I'm ready to learn." The forest held its breath, and then, slowly, he understood. The lesson was not in instruction, but in presence. To be still, to observe, to notice the faintest currents, to trust that understanding would emerge without force. The silent teacher had no words, yet conveyed more than any spoken lesson could. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet envelop him. Every breath became a signal, every heartbeat a rhythm, every pulse of the companions a note in a larger, invisible symphony. Rick felt the weight of the forest, the river, the stars, the shadow and the hidden currents, all connected, all waiting for attention. Time passed without measure. Rick did not move. He simply breathed, listened, felt. The shadow pulsed beside him, companions swirled gently, and the figure remained, a calm, guiding presence, patient and unwavering. When he finally opened his eyes, he noticed the subtle shifts in the forest. Leaves had fallen in new patterns, light filtered differently through the branches, and the companions lingered longer near him, curious and responsive. Rick realized that the lesson had taken root quietly within him. The deepest understanding comes not from action, but from stillness, reflection, and trust. He rose slowly, pressing a hand to the soft moss, and whispered, "Thank you. I will carry this with me." The silent teacher did not move, yet Rick felt a warmth, a pulse of approval. The companions twinkled in acknowledgement. The shadow stretched beside him, and Rick walked back toward the familiar path with a soft, steady sense of calm. That night, in his room, he traced the patterns and rhythms in his notebook. The lesson of stillness, patience, and silent guidance flowed across the pages, mirrored faintly in the movements of the hidden companions. Rick lay back on his bed, shadow at his side, and whispered to the night, "I will listen. I will understand. I will follow." And somewhere in the forest, the silent teacher remained patient, watching, a quiet guide in the rhythm of the unseen world. The night sky stretched above Rick like a vast, quiet ocean. Stars glimmered faintly, each one a small pulse of light, distant yet familiar. He lay on the soft moss in the forest, shadow curled beside him, companions flickering softly around the edges, and for the first time he noticed a pattern that seemed larger, more complete. It was subtle at first, a series of points, a rhythm in the placement of the lights overhead. He traced them with a finger in the air, imagining lines connecting each star, each hidden companion, each flicker of light he had seen along rivers, trees, and moss-covered paths. Slowly a constellation emerged, faint but undeniable, like a secret whispered across the night sky. Rick's heartbeat quickened with a gentle thrill. The shadow pulsed beside him, warm and steady, acknowledging the discovery. The companions gathered near, circling faintly, shimmering as though eager to share in this revelation. He traced the constellation again, slowly, mapping it in his notebook. The lines connected not just stars, but rivers, stones, hidden markings, and the currents of light he had observed. Each connection carried a subtle meaning, a whisper of the forest's deeper rhythm. Rick whispered softly, "It's all connected. All of it." The companions pulsed in response, tiny lights echoing the shapes above, weaving a delicate mirror between earth and sky. He realized that the shadow had guided him here, not just to follow paths or maps, but to see the hidden harmony of the universe, to understand that patterns exist both outward and within. He rose carefully, letting the shadow and companions move with him. The forest seemed alive with quiet acknowledgement. Leaves shimmered faintly, the river hummed beneath the surface, and the hidden maps etched in stone and moss whispered softly in recognition of the constellation above. Rick sat at the edge of the river of whispering lights, sketching the constellation in his notebook. He traced the rhythm of the hidden companions, their currents flowing in harmony with the lines in the sky. Each mark, each flicker, each pulse carried meaning, a secret language only understood through patience and observation. The shadow leaned close, a quiet reassurance. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the gentle pulse of the forest, the companions, and the stars above. He realized that understanding was not a single moment of insight, but a rhythm, a slow weaving of observation, patience, and trust. As the night deepened, Rick lay back on the moss, notebook resting on his chest. The constellation above mirrored the patterns he had traced in the world below. Hidden companions hovered, the shadow coiled nearby, and he felt a quiet harmony that resonated through him like a soft, endless melody. He whispered into the dark, "I see it now, the connections, the rhythm, the pattern. I will follow." And somewhere in the forest, the currents pulsed softly, companions shimmered faintly, and the shadow remained, patient, steady, and guiding. Rick drifted towards sleep, carrying the constellation, its quiet wisdom, and the rhythm of the unseen world with him. The forest whispered beneath the pale moonlight as Rick stepped carefully along a trail he had not noticed before. Shadow stretched beside him, steady and calm, companions flickering faintly in the corners of his vision. The night was quiet, filled only with the soft pulse of life around him, the rhythm of the trees and the hum of unseen currents. This path was different. It felt older, less traveled, yet familiar in ways he could not explain. Each step echoed softly against the moss-covered ground, a gentle reminder that the forest remembered all who walked its hidden ways. Rick followed the faint curve of the trail, noticing small patterns in the leaves, subtle bends in the branches, and soft currents in the air that seemed to guide him forward. The constellation above mirrored his movements in the night sky, each star a quiet beacon, a reassurance that he was on the right course. He paused at a small clearing where sunlight had never touched, though the moon's glow reached gently across the moss. Hidden companions gathered near, pulsing faintly in recognition, circling him in delicate arc. Rick knelt and traced a pattern in the moss, connecting lines in his mind that extended beyond the clearing, beyond the trail, into the rhythm of the forest itself. A soft breeze carried whispers through the trees, the language of forgotten paths and untold stories. Rick listened, attentive, letting the rhythm of the forest wash over him. Each whisper, each pulse of wind seemed to point toward a subtle lesson, a message from the unseen world. The shadow leaned closer, stretching along the ground like a quiet hand guiding him, while the companions flickered in response to his attention. Rick realized that these paths had always been there, waiting for someone patient enough to notice their presence, to follow without haste, to understand without force. Hours passed as he moved slowly, deliberately, tracing hidden trails, mapping the echoes of footsteps left long ago, feeling the connections between each turn, each stone, each flicker of light. The forest seemed to bend softly around him, accommodating his curiosity, revealing secrets in gentle layers. Rick whispered softly, "These paths, they remember. And now I do too." He traced the edges of a stream lined with phosphorescent moss, noting the currents and reflections of hidden lights. The companions hovered, pulsing along the edges of the water, weaving delicate arcs of connection between the forgotten paths and the constellations above. Rick felt the network of life and light, hidden yet constant, patient and alive. As dawn approached, pale light creeping through the forest, Rick sat on a fallen log and reflected quietly. The shadow coiled beside him, companions clustered gently, and he realized that each path he had walked, each map he had followed, and each secret he had discovered was part of a larger rhythm, a harmony that connected stars, rivers, forests, and hearts. Rick rose slowly, pressing his hand to the moss. He whispered into the soft morning, "I will remember. I will follow. I will listen." And with that he walked home, carrying the echoes of forgotten paths, the pulse of the forest, and the rhythm of the constellation within him. The shadow remained at his side, patient and steady, companions flitting gently in recognition as the world whispered softly, waiting for him to return. Rick stepped into the quiet forest under a sky scattered with stars, shadow flowing close at his side, companions glimmering faintly in anticipation. The night was soft, the air still, carrying only the subtle pulse of the world around him. Tonight felt different, a night for experimentation, for gentle discovery beyond mere observation. He knelt by a small clearing where the companions hovered in soft arcs of light. Rick traced a finger through the air, drawing slow curves and gentle loops. The lights responded almost immediately, flickering and weaving in harmony with his movements. Each pulse, each flicker echoed the rhythm of his hand, forming a delicate choreography of presence and attention. The shadow coiled beside him, its edges stretching in tandem, as if approving the flow of interaction. Rick whispered softly, "Let's move together." Slowly, carefully, in rhythm. The companions expanded their pattern, forming a circle of pulses around him, circling in arcs that mirrored his motions. Rick shifted slightly, and they shifted, weaving a subtle dance that flowed across the moss, around trees and over the soft earth. It was neither hurried nor chaotic. Each movement was deliberate, precise, and yet fluid, a silent dialogue of light, shadow, and awareness. Hours passed, measured only by the gentle flicker of the companions and the steady pulse of the shadow. Rick experimented, tracing larger patterns, combining arcs, curves, and loops, watching how the companions adapted, echoed, and responded. He discovered that patience was essential. The smallest disturbance could ripple outward, altering the harmony of the dance. At one point, Rick leaned back, arms extended, feeling the currents of light move around him, and realized something profound. The companions were teaching him as much as he guided them. Their patterns reflected his own inner rhythm, subtle shifts in breath, thought, and intention. The forest seemed to breathe with him, the trees swaying faintly, the river murmuring softly, as though the entire world were participating in this quiet, intricate ballet. The constellation above mirrored the arcs and curves below, connecting earth and sky, shadow and light, movement and stillness. Rick whispered into the night, "I see the balance now. I feel the connection. Together we move." The companions responded with a gentle crescendo of flickers, the shadow stretching proudly beside him, and Rick felt a deep sense of calm, joy, and wonder. He understood that influence was not domination. It was gentle guidance, respect for rhythm, and trust in the unseen. As dawn's first light touched the treetops, Rick sank into the moss, exhausted but serene. The companions lingered briefly, their pulses softening, before retreating into the forest's hidden corners. The shadow coiled at his side, patient and steady, a quiet reassurance of continuity. Rick rose slowly, brushing dew from his hands, and whispered to the forest, "Thank you for this dance. I will carry it with me." That morning, he returned home, notebook in hand, tracing the patterns of light and shadow across the pages, capturing the delicate choreography of the night. And as he lay in bed that night, shadow at his side, he felt the gentle pulse of companions, constellations, and unseen currents. A rhythm that would follow him, quietly guiding each step, each breath, each thought. Rick had wandered farther than usual that morning, shadow at his side, companions flitting faintly ahead, when he noticed a slight disturbance in the moss near a gnarled tree root. Kneeling, he brushed away the leaves and earth, revealing a worn piece of parchment, edges frayed, faint lines etched into its surface. It was an old map, the kind one might dismiss as forgotten. But Rick felt immediately that it was not ordinary. The lines seemed to shimmer faintly, responding to the pulse of the companions and the subtle stretch of the shadow beside him. He traced the contours with a finger, noticing that they echoed the currents he had observed in the forest, the patterns of the hidden companions, and even the arcs of the constellation above. The map was a reflection, a mirror of rhythms both earthly and celestial, of currents and light, of presence and observation. Rick whispered softly, This belongs to everything I've been learning." The companions gathered near, flickering in acknowledgement, tracing lines over the map with delicate arcs of light. The shadow coiled beside him, stretching slightly, a quiet pulse of approval. Rick felt a gentle warmth in his chest, a connection to the centuries, perhaps millennia, of careful observation and patient attention that this map represented. He knelt for hours, tracing the lines, following the paths, imagining the rivers, streams, and forests that had once existed, some perhaps long gone, yet preserved in subtle echoes through the currents of light. Each line, each mark, resonated with the hidden companions whose pulses mirrored the intricate flow of the map. Rick realized that the map was not a guide in the usual sense. It did not point the way with arrows or instructions. Instead, it revealed connections, subtle relationships between places, currents, and presences. It whispered patience, observation, and trust in the quiet rhythms of the world. He traced a pattern over a river marked faintly on the parchment. The companions responded immediately, their light arcs following the flow of the lines, linking the river to a patch of forest, to a hidden clearing, and even to the shadow at his side. Rick smiled softly, understanding that he was beginning to read the language of the world more fully, a language written in patterns, pulses, and silent guidance. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, yet Rick remained absorbed, tracing, observing, learning. He whispered gently, "I see it now, the connections, the echoes, the rhythm. I will follow." As night fell, the shadow stretched beside him, companions circling softly, and Rick rose, carefully folding the map, feeling its subtle pulse of history and presence. He carried it back to his room, where he laid it alongside his notebook, patterns and constellations spilling across pages, the echoes of currents, rivers, and light weaving a silent symphony. That night, as he lay in bed, shadow coiled at his side, companion somewhere in the forest, Rick whispered softly, "Thank you for showing me this. I will listen. I will understand. I will carry it with me." The stars above seemed to shimmer in gentle acknowledgement. The hidden currents hummed faintly in the dark, and Rick drifted into sleep, carrying the quiet wisdom of the map, the companions, and the shadow with him. Rick awoke to a night wrapped in stillness, the forest breathing softly around him. Shadow stretched beside him, patient and calm, while hidden companions flickered faintly, teasing the edges of vision. Tonight felt different, alive with a gentle expectation. He walked slowly along the familiar paths, noticing how the companions moved in larger arcs, weaving faint patterns across the moss, the stones, and the streams. The currents of light pulsed in quiet harmony, almost as though the forest itself were preparing for something. A gentle festival, hidden yet present, subtle yet radiant. Rick followed the flow, letting the shadow guide him, companions circling along, and arrived at a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. There, the companions gathered in a delicate swirl, each light pulsing in rhythm with the others. The shadows stretched and contracted alongside them, as if dancing with the lights. He realized it was not a festival in the usual sense. There were no songs, no laughter, no noise. It was a quiet celebration, a convergence of currents, presences, and patterns, all acknowledging one another in perfect harmony. Rick knelt and extended a hand, and the companions responded, flowing along his gestures, forming arcs and loops of gentle illumination. The forest itself seemed to pulse in response. Trees swayed faintly, leaves shimmering in the moonlight, rivers reflecting soft patterns of light. Even the stars above flickered in tandem, subtle and quiet, their distant brilliance echoing the movements below. Rick traced a circle in the air with his hand, and the companions followed, weaving loops and spirals. He whispered softly, This is the rhythm, the connection. I see it now." The shadow pulsed beside him, a steady beat in the quiet, while the companions created intricate patterns of movement, echoing the constellation above and the currents traced in his notebooks. Rick felt a deep calm settle over him, a feeling of belonging to something larger, something patient, timeless and alive. Hours passed unnoticed. The companions danced, the shadow coiled in quiet support, and Rick remained in the center of the festival, tracing patterns, feeling the currents, and absorbing the subtle lessons woven into each movement. When the first pale hints of dawn appeared, the companions gradually dispersed, flowing back into the corners of the forest, leaving behind a faint hum in the air, a lingering rhythm in the earth. The shadow remained at Rick's side, patient and steady. Rick stood slowly, pressing a hand to the moss, and whispered softly, "Thank you for this dance, for this rhythm, for letting me see." He returned home, notebook in hand, capturing the patterns of the night, the subtle choreography of light and shadow, and the quiet pulse of the forest. That evening, as he lay in bed, shadow coiled beside him, Rick whispered softly, "I will follow. I will listen. I will understand." And somewhere in the forest, the currents pulsed faintly. Companions shimmered softly, and the night held its quiet celebration, a gentle, eternal festival of light, shadow, and presence. Rick lay on the soft moss beneath a sky scattered with quiet stars, shadow curled beside him, companions flitting faintly at the edges of his vision. The forest hummed with the faint pulse of life, the hidden currents of light weaving silently through the trees, streams, and stones. Tonight, he felt the fullness of it all, the constellation, the companions, the shadow, the currents, and the gentle rhythm of his own presence within the world. He traced a line in the air, small and deliberate, and the companions followed, echoing his movements in delicate arcs. The shadow pulsed gently beside him, a constant and patient reminder of the lessons learned: patience, observation, trust, and quiet understanding. Rick closed his eyes and let the patterns fill him. He remembered the first hidden light, the first whispered rhythm, the discovery of the old map, the festival of gentle lights. Each memory was a thread, weaving together into a tapestry that stretched from the moss beneath him to the stars above. He whispered softly, Everything is connected." The companions flitted closer, pulsing in quiet affirmation. The shadow coiled around him, steady and warm. Rick breathed slowly, feeling the rhythm of all things, the pulses, the currents, the hidden presence of lives and light intertwined. He realized that understanding was not a destination, but a living, breathing experience, constantly unfolding with attention and care. Rick rose slowly, pressing his hand to the moss, feeling the subtle vibrations of the forest, the companions, and the constellation above. He looked to the sky, tracing the constellation with his eyes, seeing it reflected in the hidden currents of the world below. The shadow stretched beside him, companions pulsed softly around him, and Rick felt a quiet exhale in his chest, a sense of completion, of harmony, and of being part of something larger than himself. He whispered to the night, "I will carry this with me. I will follow. I will listen. I will understand." As the first light of dawn brushed the treetops, Rick lay back once more on the moss, shadow at his side, companions retreating into their hidden corners. The constellation above shimmered faintly, reflecting in the forest streams, the moss, and in Rick's heart. All the lessons, discoveries, and rhythms converged into a quiet symphony, the reflection of all things gentle, patient, and eternal. Rick exhaled, a soft smile on his face, and whispered into the forest, "Thank you. Thank you for this journey, for every pulse and light, for every quiet lesson." And with that, he stretched gently, letting the shadow coil beside him, companions flicker softly, and somewhere he was still part of the endless rhythm of the world, moving with the currents, tracing the patterns, listening to the quiet whispers of life. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The forest lay silent under a sky that shimmered faintly with distant stars. Rick moved slowly along the familiar paths, shadow flowing beside him like a steady, quiet river. The hidden companions flickered softly around him, their movements deliberate, almost reverent, as though the night itself had asked for stillness. He paused in a small clearing where moonlight touched the moss, brushing across ancient stones and hidden streams. Rick noticed the faint trails left by the companions, subtle patterns that had become familiar over countless nights. Each pulse, each flicker, felt like a whisper from the universe. a gentle reminder of presence, attention, and connection. Rick knelt and traced a pattern in the moss, watching the companions mirror his movements in delicate arcs of light. Shadow coiled beside him, steady, patient, a comforting pulse in the quiet dark. He whispered softly, "It's all here. Every step, every moment, every quiet lesson." The forest seemed to breathe around him, leaves rustling faintly, rivers murmuring beneath the earth, the stars above reflecting in streams and puddles alike. Rick realized that each hidden companion, each current of light, each rhythm of shadow was part of an endless reflection. A soft, unbroken conversation between the universe and those willing to observe. He rose slowly, letting the shadow stretch along the moss, companions circling gently, and felt a deep sense of completion. Every map traced, every pattern drawn, every pulse followed had led him here, to a quiet understanding that presence, patience, and attention were the true journeys of all things. Rick whispered to the night, "I will remember. I will follow. I will listen. I will understand." The companions flickered softly, their light echoing faintly in the distant trees, weaving delicate patterns that mirrored the constellation above. The shadow pulsed in gentle affirmation, a steady heartbeat beside him. Rick lay back on the moss, gazing upward, letting the rhythm of the night wash over him. The stars shimmered faintly, the companions rested in hidden nooks, and the shadow coiled beside him like a guardian. Rick felt the quiet pulse of the world, the gentle hum of unseen currents, and the delicate whisper of life itself. Everything he had learned, observed, and shared was here, in him, in the forest, and in the soft light of the stars. He exhaled slowly, a gentle smile on his face, and whispered, "Thank you for all of this, for every pulse, every light, every quiet lesson." And with that, he stretched gently, letting the shadow coil beside him, companions glimmer softly. And somewhere, he was still part of the rhythm of the universe, listening to the soft whispers of stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick lay on the soft moss beneath a sky brushed with the faint shimmer of distant stars. Shadow coiled beside him, companions resting quietly in their hidden corners. The forest held its breath in a gentle hush, as though aware that tonight would mark the culmination of countless lessons, countless rhythms, countless nights of discovery. He traced a finger through the air, the faint arcs of light from the companions responding with subtle pulses. Each flicker reflected not only his movements, but the echoes of all he had witnessed, the constellation above, the old map, the festival of lights, the currents, the hidden companions, the whispered rhythms of the forest. Rick whispered softly, "It's time to let go." The shadow pulsed beside him, steady and unwavering, a quiet affirmation of understanding. Rick closed his eyes and felt the currents of the forest, the pulses of the companions, and the heartbeat of the night merging into one gentle rhythm. Every lesson, every step, every quiet moment of reflection flowed into this single, unbroken harmony. He remembered the first hidden light, the first pulse of the companions, the discovery of the map, the constellation traced across the sky, the dances of shadow and light. Each memory shimmered softly in his mind, like stars fading into dawn, delicate and precious. Rick exhaled, a slow, gentle release. "Thank you for every whisper, every light, every shadow, every gentle lesson," he murmured. The companions flickered faintly in response, pulsing with the rhythm of quiet acknowledgement. The shadow coiled beside him, calm and patient, as if promising to remain with him even as the night receded. Rick felt a profound sense of closure, not of endings, but of continuity. He carried everything he had learned inside him, woven into the fabric of his being. The forest seemed to hum softly, a final lullaby of moss, leaves, water, and hidden currents. Rick lay back fully, letting the gentle exhale of the night wrap around him. He understood, finally, that the journey had never been about discovery alone, but about presence, attention, and the quiet love of observation. He whispered into the dark, "I will follow. I will remember. I will listen. I will understand." And with that he stretched gently, letting the shadow coil beside him, companions flicker softly. And somewhere he was still moving with the rhythm of the universe, part of the currents, part of the stars, part of the gentle, eternal whisper of life. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick walked slowly along the forest's edge, shadows stretched beside him, companions hovering gently at the periphery of his vision. The horizon glowed faintly with the first touch of dawn, soft pinks and blues blending into the night's remaining darkness. He felt the quiet pulse of the world beneath his feet, the rhythm of leaves, rivers, stones, and hidden currents beneath the moss. He paused on a small rise, looking across the vast expanse of the forest, the distant rivers shimmering faintly, the streams of light from hidden companions tracing delicate patterns among the trees. Rick felt an overwhelming sense of connection, not only to the forest, the shadow, or the constellation above, but to every gentle movement, every whisper, every soft pulse he had ever noticed. The shadow coiled beside him, steady and calm, companions circling softly in arcs of light. Rick whispered into the soft morning, "It's all part of the same rhythm, every step, every breath, every flicker of light. It flows together." He knelt, placing a hand lightly on the moss, and felt the quiet energy of the earth pulse beneath him. Memories of the hidden companions, the festival of lights, the old map, and the constellation traced in the sky flowed through him like gentle currents. Each lesson, each quiet revelation seemed to stretch outward, connecting him to the forest, to the stars, to the unseen rhythms of life itself. Rick breathed deeply, letting the wind carry his awareness across the horizon. The companions flickered gently, the shadow pulsed slowly beside him, and he understood that the journey was never about reaching a destination, but about noticing the quiet, endless dance of presence and attention. He whispered softly, "I will carry this rhythm wherever I go." The pulse, the light, the shadow, everything alive in quiet harmony. The forest seemed to respond, leaves trembling gently, rivers murmuring faintly, and the currents of the hidden companions weaving delicate paths across moss, stones, and streams. Rick felt an extraordinary peace settle over him, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you are part of something much larger than yourself. Patient, eternal, and tender. He lay down on the soft moss, shadow curling beside him, companions resting in gentle loops, and looked toward the soft horizon. Light and dark, shadow and pulse, memory and presence, all stretched outward in quiet, delicate continuity. Rick felt a sense of completeness, not finality, but gentle continuity, as though the world itself was exhaling in calm approval. He whispered once more, "Thank you, for the stars, for the currents, for the quiet lessons. I see now. Everything is connected." And with that, he stretched gently into the soft horizon, shadow at his side, companions flickering softly in acknowledgement, and somewhere he was still moving, with the rhythm of the universe, part of the currents, part of the stars, part of the gentle, eternal whisper of life. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. The night was quiet, yet alive with faint pulses of hidden light. Rick walked along the winding forest trails, shadow flowing gently beside him, companions glimmering softly in arcs around him. The constellation above seemed to shine a little brighter tonight, each star reflecting the quiet rhythm of his steps, each flicker of the companions echoing patterns he had traced countless times before. He reached a small stream, its waters reflecting the stars in soft, rippling patterns. Rick knelt beside it, watching the light dance across the surface, tracing paths that mirrored the movements of companions, shadow, and his own heartbeat. Everything seemed to converge here, the lessons, the discoveries, the quiet currents of presence, forming a luminous path that stretched outward in gentle arcs. Rick whispered softly, "All of it. It flows together. Every shadow, every flicker, every pulse." The companions responded, weaving loops and spirals above the stream, their soft light tracing faint trails that glimmered on the water. The shadows stretched beside him, steady and patient, a quiet heartbeat in the rhythm of the night. Rick felt a deep, serene connection. The constellation above, the companions, the currents in the forest, and even the patterns of moss and stone beneath him, all part of a single, luminous rhythm. He stood slowly, placing a hand lightly on the cool stream. The water reflected his image, the shadow, and the flickering lights of the companions, as though the forest itself were acknowledging his journey. He realized that understanding was not a matter of reaching the end, but of noticing, of tracing, of moving with the quiet currents of life. Rick whispered again, "I will follow. I will listen. I will remember. I will understand." The companions swirled gently around him, forming arcs of light that echoed the constellation, the currents, and the shadow's steady pulse. Rick walked slowly along the luminous path, shadow coiled beside him, companions circling softly, and felt a profound sense of peace. Every step was part of a rhythm, every breath a note in a quiet, unbroken melody that stretched through forest, river, moss, stars and light. Hours passed in stillness, and Rick lay down on the moss beside the stream, shadow curling at his side, companions resting in gentle arcs. The forest hummed softly, the stars pulsed faintly, and Rick felt the luminous path flowing through him, a rhythm that was eternal, patient, and gentle. He exhaled slowly, a soft smile on his face, and whispered into the night, "Thank you for everything, for the stars, the currents, the companions, the shadow, and the gentle lessons." And with that he stretched along the luminous path, shadow at his side, companions flickering softly, and somewhere he was still moving with the rhythm of the universe, part of the currents, part of the stars, part of the gentle, eternal whisper of life. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick lay beneath a sky scattered with stars, shadow curled beside him, companions resting softly in their hidden corners. The forest exhaled quietly around him, the leaves rustling faintly, the streams murmuring softly, and the distant constellations pulsing in gentle rhythm. Tonight felt timeless, as if the world itself were breathing slowly, patiently, and he was part of its endless exhale. He traced a small arc in the air, and the companions responded, weaving gentle loops of light around him. Shadow pulsed beside him, steady and warm, a quiet heartbeat that had followed him through every step, every lesson, every discovery. Rick felt the pulse of the universe beneath his hands, in the forest, in the constellation above, and in the subtle flickers of the hidden companions. He whispered softly, "It's all here. Everything I've learned, every quiet rhythm, every gentle moment. It's all part of the same song. Rick closed his eyes and let himself float in the harmony of presence. He remembered the first hidden light, the festival of gentle currents, the map, the constellation, the luminous paths, and the quiet dances of shadow and companions. Each memory shimmered softly, a note in a vast, endless melody that stretched from earth to stars, from shadow to light, from moment to moment. The forest seemed to lean in, soft winds brushing the leaves, rivers reflecting faint arcs of light, and the companions pulsing softly in acknowledgement. Rick felt a profound peace settle over him, a sense of completeness not rooted in endings but in continuity. Every lesson, every movement, every pulse was part of an eternal rhythm that would carry on, gentle and patient. He rose slowly, stretching, shadow coiled at his side, companions circling in delicate arcs. Rick whispered to the night, "Thank you for the stars, the currents, the shadow, the companions, for every gentle lesson. I will carry it all with me." The first light of dawn touched the horizon, soft and luminous, blending seamlessly with the fading stars. Rick lay back once more, shadow beside him, companions resting in arcs of gentle light. He felt the world's pulse, the rhythm of all things, the quiet exhale of the universe. It was not an ending, only a continuation, a gentle flowing of presence, memory, and love. And somewhere, he was still moving with the rhythm of the universe, tracing currents, following light, listening to shadows, part of the eternal, patient, and gentle whisper of life. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.